Welcome back. In this video I'm going to show you how to create a procedurally generated brushed metal shader. So here we are back in our course materials.blend file, and we have our sphere object, and we're going to do the texturing on the sphere object, and we're going to do that for two reasons. One of those reasons is the UVs on this sphere are not very good. So let's have a look first of all. Let's go into our UV editor, select our object, hit tab and go into edit mode, and you can see our UVs on this object are kind of weird. Probably not what you would expect a sphere to be unwrapped as. Let's go back to our shader editor. Let's apply a material to this object. I'm going to call this brushed metal. Now, before we go any further, anytime that you're doing any kind of texturing or even modeling for that matter, it's always a good idea to look at reference. So I have an asset browser editor window on the bottom left hand side, and I'm going to change it down to an image editor. So this is a really good way of putting reference in your scenes. So I'm going to go to my reference image folder here, and these are just images I got off Google. Made sure to search only for images with a copyright-free license, so a CC0 license, meaning that they're available for commercial use, for personal use, teaching, anything like that. And this is the kind of material that we're going to create. So with our object selected and our principled BSDF node in our scene, now we have to worry about creating this texture. The way we're going to do that is with a noise texture map. So I'm just going to grab a noise texture, and before I do anything else, let's add in our texture coordinate nodes. These are going to be extremely important in this particular section, because a lot of the ways that we create interesting texture maps using procedurals is by manipulating the different mapping on our textures. Sometimes it's not enough just to manipulate the scale and the detail and things like that in the actual nodes. Sometimes we have to manipulate things like the rotation, the location, and the scale of those texture maps as well. So let's zoom in a little bit. Let's look at our noise texture and see what we have so far. So at the moment we have this cloudy material. Now let's have a look at those UVs. So by default we are set up with generated texture coordinates. Let's change that to UV, and immediately you can see that we have these seams on our object. If we look at it from a few different angles, you can see it's really apparent, especially on the top. Let's go back to our camera view. Anytime I do procedural textures, I try to stick to object mapping. The reason for that is all the UVs are set up, or not the UVs, but the texture coordinates are set up based on the bounding box of the object. That has a few advantages, especially when you're in a large scene where you're applying the same material to many different objects of different sizes. It makes it really easy to avoid the need to do any unwrapping at all. So with this set to object, I'm also going to change a setting in mapping. Now at the moment we're set to point, which at the moment means that we are transforming from a certain point on our UVs. So if I was to take the scale and increase that, we would actually squeeze it down on the x-axis, and you can even see we're getting some of that brush metal look at the moment. I actually find it a little bit easier to work with these types when it's set to texture. So now if we do the x-axis, you can see it actually stretches out. So as we increase the scale, our texture is getting bigger. I actually prefer it where I'm decreasing the scale to get this kind of stretching effect. So we are going to stretch this down, and we'll stretch it to maybe something around about 1.5. So at the moment we're already stretching our coordinates, but we can get even more detail by changing some settings in our texture coordinate node. But before we do that, we want to replicate this horizontal brush. At the moment it's going vertically. So we can just rotate this, and we'll rotate it on the y-axis. Let's rotate that by 90 degrees. Now one thing that we can point out here is if we rotate around our object, we can see we're getting a nice effect on the top. At the moment it's not very apparent, but we'll have some issues on the top. Let's change our scale, and let's just increase this up to maybe around about 50 or so. Okay, and you can see one of our issues is coming out already, in that we have stretched our coordinates and we've taken our scale down quite low, and all our stretching has mostly disappeared. So the way to fix this would be to start manipulating these other scales. So let's go into our camera view again. Let's try in the y-axis, let's increase that. And this isn't really giving us the effect we want. Let's take that back to 1. And let's take the z-axis and increase that. And now we're getting that stretching. But we're only getting it on that one axis. So let's also take the y-axis and stretch that as well. And now we're stretching around all these axes. And we're getting a much better brush metal look. Now I'm going to take both these values to around about 50. And now I'm really getting big, long stretches across my entire object. So again, in the front view, let's manipulate some more settings in noise texture. Let's increase that detail all the way up. And let's add a little bit more roughness to it as well. So maybe around about 0.8. And let's zoom right in. Now, it's probably not quite apparent on the recording, but there's not much contrast on this. It might just be showing up as a flat grey on your screen. I hope not. So let's increase the contrast on this by adding a colour ramp node. So this is a node that we should be quite familiar with by now. We can take up our black values, make that a little bit more contrasty, and we can take down our white values as well. And it just gives us a lot more contrast on our texture. Now let's go in here and zoom in a little bit. And we'll just increase this distortion just a little bit. And that just gives us a little bit more variation in our brush marks. So that's essentially our base normal map. Now, at this point, again, we should be pretty familiar with the fact that we can't plug a color into a normal. We need a converter, and that's the vector bump node. So let's plug that into height, plug the normal into normal, and look at our result. Okay, and you can see that the effect we're getting kind of looks like a diffuse map. We're not getting a metallic map. We're not really getting much of an effect of the bump, or at least it's really hard to see the effect of the bump. And that's because we've not made any changes to our principled node so far. We also have this set in base color, which we don't want. So I'm going to use Control, right click and drag to create this little knife tool. And I can just use that to cut this node. So now we don't have anything in our base color. We're working with metal, so let's take metallic all the way up. And let's take the roughness down a little bit. Now we can see some strange artifacts on our object. Now the reason for that is, and it might not be super apparent at the moment, is because our bump node is set so high. So let's take this distance down to something a little bit more suitable for this material. Now if you think about brush metal, the depth of the gouges in it created by the brushing is very, very small. So let's take that down to 0.05. And let's take the strength away down as well. Now, if you ever rub your fingers across brush metal, it actually feels smooth. It doesn't really feel like it's got the brush strokes in it. It's very, very fine. So let's take this strength to, let's try about 0.1. And let's look at that object. And that looks pretty good. Now, at this point, we could make some adjustments. We could take our blacks and our whites and spread them back out a little bit, just because we used that really to get more contrast on the screen, but in the actual shader, we don't want quite as big a difference in those values. We could take our scale, we could decrease it, and you can see that makes a little bit of a difference to our texture, but not as much as you might expect. The main difference we'll change here is these scale values. So if we increase this scale up a little bit, you can see our texture stops getting squeezed as much, and as such we get a more rough texture there. We can increase these to bring that back a little bit. Let's take that to maybe 250. That's a little bit better. Let's maybe take that scale back down a little bit. think that looks okay. And that's essentially our brush metal shader. Now at this point we could add some more texture maps onto this to give more effects. I think maybe we'll want this scale up a little bit higher. Again, it's just what looks convincing to you, not necessarily what's super realistic. And I think I'm pretty happy with that material as it is just now. Now, unlike when we created this material before, we don't need to use the anisotropic setting. If we add that in vertically, we do get a nice effect, but we're almost getting the same effect from the texture itself. So if you are going to use that effect, I would definitely recommend trying to keep it quite subtle. Maybe only put it about halfway if you use it at all. I think in this case we will use it. Now in a later section we will be looking at adding different variations to roughness and base colour, but I think that's okay for this material. Let's add just one more node in here. Let's grab a texture, noise texture node. Again, we're going to be using object mapping. Let's look at this material. We are going to take the scale all the way up to 1000. Full detail, full roughness. And we're going to mix this with the bump map. Now this is actually going to go after this node. So let's use Shift Control, right click, drag through that and recreate this mix node. Now let's take this node from mix to multiply. And we'll look at our result here. And you can see we get something a little bit more rough. Let's take this factor all the way down. So this is without the additional noise texture. And this is with all the additional noise texture. Now I think the denoising is taking out some of that effect. So let's open this back up and turn off denoising completely. Okay, and now you can see that we're getting a bit more of a rough texture. That's trying to emulate the roughness that we have on the reference image. It might be a little bit too strong. We'll take it down to about 0.75 just to make it a little bit more subtle. And that's it. That's our brushed material. Okay, so it's challenge time again. Your challenge in this video is to create your own brushed metal texture. Add it to your material library by marking it as an asset. And then you're going to create a primitive object and see how the texture looks on that object. It can be any object you want. Have a go and try that. Okay, so I hope you had fun with that challenge and you were able to create a primitive and add your material to it and check out the effect. So I have the sphere in the scene at the moment. Let's just do a little experiment. Let's delete that sphere and I'm going to add a cube to my scene. And let's just move that over a little bit and apply that brushed metal material to it. And let's have a look at the results. Now I'm noticing a lot of black in our reflection. So let me just check my scene world. So I still have the strength set to 0 from a previous lecture. So let's turn that up so we can see our effect a little bit clearer. Now what we see is we see our brush metal on the side of it, all the way around. But if we look on the top, we just get this kind of rough metal effect. We're not getting any brush marks at all on this. So the reason for that is the way that we've created this shader, it really only works on the sides of objects because of the way that we've created the scale and the rotation. There's a way to get around this. What we have to do is we have to use a technique that we used previously in the course where we apply two different materials to the same object. So we did this on the candle object where we had the wick being one material and the rest of the candle being a wax material. So we're going to do the same thing here. I'll just go to edit mode. And with the top face selected, we're going to go to our material settings in the properties panel, add a new material. This material is going to be a duplicate of the first one, which I've already created, brush 001, and we're going to assign that to that material. And we can come out of object mode, and now you can see that we have these brush marks on the top of our object. So what is the difference between brush metal 001 and brush metal? Well, here we have brush metal 001, and you can see all our rotations are zeroed out. And if we go to brush metal, you can see that we still have 0, 90, and 0. Okay, let's go back to brush metal 001, and we can see all our rotations are zeroed out. So essentially what we've done is we've rotated our mapping by 90 degrees because our face that we want to affect is 90 degrees to the faces that we have the correct material on. Okay, so one final thing before we end this video. I've renamed both of these materials, brush metal and brush metal top face, and that way with them both marked as assets, I can use either one of them in whichever scene I want, and it saves me going in and duplicating the material later on and changing these rotations. It's just a little bit quicker having both of those materials in your asset library. Now, this file is going to be available to download. It's going to be called Brushed Metal End. It will also have all the other parts of the scene, the backdrop, the lights, and all the other materials we've created in this course up to this point. So if you haven't been working along or you've skipped to this section, you'll have access to all the scene files through there without having to go back and redoing everything. So now that we've looked at this quite simple brushed metal material, let's move on to a new material in the next video. I'll see you then.